Welcome to the 43rd episode of First Person Podcast. To commemorate our transition to YouTube, this is part one of a three-part series that we will be doing to examine how games are introduced to us and played with on YouTube. For part one, we are going to be looking at the Parasocial play involved with a lot of retro and modern YouTube content. From walkthroughs to Let's Plays, this is the foundation of our YouTube gaming experience. But before we begin, who the hell is everybody, and what have you been playing recently?
Hi, I am Sabrina. I am the editor-in-chief and also the section head for book reviews. And lately I've been playing a lot of Civilization 6, but also The Witcher 3.
My name's Patrick. I am managing editor and head of essays. And apparently I'm digging visual novels crossed with other games because I've gotten back into Hades again and beat Hades for the first time. So that's felt really good. And I've been just really getting deep into Persona 5 and enjoying how iffy it is. Not enjoying how iffy it is. I'm 50 hours in. I'm like, okay, there's 50 hours more. And I'm just, I'm in for the long haul.
There's more than 50 probably. It's great though. I'm so excited for you. I love that game so much. It is super iffy, but that's another podcast. Hi, I'm Alex. I'm the head of commentaries. I've been in super basic gamer mode, and so I finished Bloodborne and then immediately was like, I need more of this, and so now I'm playing Dark Souls on Switch, and that's basically where I'm at these days.
You're finding them too easy, eh?
No, not at all. And I'm a heavy user and supporter of using guides in those games. But I've realized that beating my head against the boss, it's become a sort of mental exercise for me, or I don't know, or psychological exercise. The point is, I feel a kind of zen just losing to a boss over and over again. In a way that I can just put on some music or a podcast and just beat my head against a game for a while, and I find it really relaxing and enjoyable.
That's a different take on kind of the grind of the Souls. So that's cool. I like it.
It happened when I was doing the hardest boss in Bloodborne, and by the time I beat him, I didn't realize I didn't realize I was winning that fight because I was doing it for the 100th time, and suddenly I was like, oh, his health is really low, and I think at some point in that process, I trained this new mode of relating to the game into myself.
And I'm Giuseppe Femia. I am your host and the podcast producer here at FPS. And I've been playing Dark Souls, but I've been kind of walking Sabrina through it as I play because she didn't want to play the game by herself. But I found that this was a unique compromise in which I get to have somebody watch me play the game, and I can tell everybody the millions of hours of lore that I've memorized.
Yeah, it's actually been awesome because I love Dark Souls from afar. I've never been able to play it, and so this was a really great way for me to actually experience the game that I really admire and that everybody talks about without having to deal with the scariness of not winning.
Honestly, there's maybe an entire episode of this podcast we could do on just dealing with Dark Souls psychologically, because we've already discussed 3 completely different relationships to the game, and I'm sure Patrick has one too.
Yeah, it's mostly avoidance. It's I'm I gotta try it, and then I'm like, oh right, this isn't for me.
Well, there we go then. Patrick can ask the questions in that episode.
Anyways, we're here to talk about YouTube, so we should probably get into that at some point. First question, just as a warm-up, when did everyone get into YouTube, and what was really the appeal?
I feel like we're going to age me a little bit here. YouTube generally, I think I don't know, I want to say I was 8 years old, so that would have been 2000 and something. Yeah, I don't know. I want to say 2008, 2009-ish. Oh, so then I was older than 8. Whatever, it doesn't matter. I was young. And it was all the memes and the first viral videos that got me into that. And then I think later on it switched to watching gamers on YouTube by the mid 2010s, I think, is when I started getting into it and watching a lot of lore videos. And that's actually the first time I really experienced Dark Souls was through YouTube and watching lore videos on YouTube.
That's cool. This is actually going to age me in the opposite direction. I remember being maybe at the end of high school or having just graduated high school, and my friend telling me that there were Space Ghost Coast to Coast episodes on YouTube that you could watch for free. I kind of like dipped my toe in, but kind of didn't see much of the use of YouTube until I started to get into like retro game collecting and movie collecting and watching channels about different retro games and different like DVDs and horror movies and stuff like that.
So I think probably around the same time. The year was 2006. I must have been like 15. I was an incredibly online teen and like spent a lot of my time on like webcomic forums, which is really maybe the most humiliating thing I can admit about my past. Uh, and YouTube just hit those forums hard because they were already deeply into like early memes, or they were calling them macros at the time. And then from there, I found out that a bit like YouTube, you could watch things on YouTube, like TV series, and so I think that's how I watched like the first season and a bit of Bleach, because there was just a ton of anime sitting on that website. Although Bleach may have been on Google Videos, which at the same time was a separate thing, but very much the same principle.
I first got into YouTube back in like the first year of high school for me, so that would have been like 2014 when I was 2010 when I was 14. But for the most part, I was using it to look up like stand-up comedy because that was my form of escapism through the depressing life that was my high school. But as stuff like Smosh came into the foreground and like comedy creators were like coming forward with videos that they made, like using the actual games. Like I think I started to watch the Rooster Teeth stuff that they did with what was the Halo Red versus
Blue,
which was just kind of revolutionary because this is the stuff that I would be like thinking of in my head as like little skits and stuff like that.
I'm trying to remember because I also watched Red versus Blue, and I feel like there was a time where it was like hosted somewhere like pre-YouTube, like they hosted it natively on their site or something like that. That's fascinating to think that there was a pre-YouTube.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that we all got into YouTube through like different channels, and it was kind of like this conglomerate of a melting pot that just kind of like eventually adapted to fit every genre.
I find it interesting that you started with Rooster Teeth. I hear like so much about like Rooster Teeth and like Smosh and like Game Grumps and those kind of YouTubers. And I just like that was just a area of YouTube I'm now catching up to. Like I never watched those. I don't know where I was or what I was doing. I guess I was just watching boring guys showing off their DVD collections, but yeah, I don't know. I find this whole world I never experienced before via YouTube.
Red versus Blue was around the same time as like Machinima, like RB and the Chief, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because that I feel like that's when I really started to be on YouTube all the time. So that actually was even earlier than 2008. Was that like 2004 or 5 or something like that?
Well, and to my mind, Red versus Blue is also kind of like this point, or Machinima more broadly is also one of these places where like the online like content / humor / like meme TV infrastructure started breaking out of, at least in my world, primarily like Newgrounds. Like
Yes.
it feels like a lot of what used to be on Newgrounds eventually became early YouTube.
Yeah, that sounds about right, because I do remember Newgrounds. I think that's also when like that whole meme lord type of culture was really catching waves. I still to this day quote RB and the Chief every once in a while, so like just goes to show how much of a hold that has on me at least.
So are we also looking here maybe for like sort of the junction, like the points of junction where we start encountering this sort of more contemporary like YouTube ecosystem? Because I think that one thing that Joey kind of hit on here is that like there have been waves of sort of, or sort of distinct moments in what YouTube is and what the content is there. And when we're talking about the sort of parasocial gaming stuff, I don't think it was there at the beginning, at least in the form it is now. And for instance, like Smosh is something that I first encountered while babysitting, in when I was in like the first years of art school, I think. And so that was something that totally just like, that was, I think, the least online I ever was those years, and so that kind of passed me by.
Yeah, there wasn't really ever a structure at the beginning of YouTube where like things were like set up in terms of like episodic events or consistent content that people put out. It was just kind of like a bunch of people doing these very abstract concepts and doing whatever they wanted to with them. The first like Let's Plays, I think, weren't even really meant for like comedy purposes. They were just like things that people put up online to show people how to beat the games that others might have a hard time with, and they took the form of like what we would find in a PowerPoint or a Microsoft Excel how-to video today.
I still use those today, like the video walkthroughs. They're sometimes helpful if you can't, find stuff. Or sometimes I just want to know how many hours I have to sink into a game, and then you look at a playthrough and it tells you.
I'm just thinking, the first time I think I encountered a Let's Play, it was in such a bizarre context. It was a channel that my friend showed me called Retsupre, which is not a great name to have in 2021. Their whole thing was they had this series where they would Let's Play, actually, speaking of Newgrounds, they would Let's Play horror games on Newgrounds, and just absolutely tear them apart. And that was like, I feel like that couldn't have been later than 2008. And so already, like, YouTube only went up in, I think, 2005, 2006. Within a few years of that, we already see the sort of emergence of this genre, like, where it's not just this sort of modeling of play or like here's some footage of the game happening, but already these sort of like these aspects of commentary and personality are going into it.
Yeah, I feel that like playing through horror games was a big part of kind of like how we see streaming and Let's Plays now, because that was huge. Like that's how PewDiePie got started, was like playing the Slender Last Level, and you just saw him get scared all the time, and so many people were like copying that.
Well, and Markiplier, whose entire brand basically was having extremely funny facial expressions when games scared him, and like just generally having these really over the top reactions to these games.
So, as academics, because that's what we all are, what sort of questions slash concerns do we have about parasocial play on YouTube, just as it is now and where it originated?
I can kick this one off. I mean, we've sort of already started touching on this, but one thing that really interests me is sort of in how it fits into sort of ecologies of play, like these sort of media ecological questions about like what it means for YouTube to exist within like the matrix of gaming media. Like we've already spoken about like for example like Dark Souls lore videos, and then for me, like YouTube is a big part of how, I'm talking about playing Dark Souls and Bloodborne. I watch YouTube videos constantly because those games stress me out and I just want to know how to do certain things quickly. So like I'm constantly looking up how to, do extremely narrow things in those games. I don't know how to imagine my relationship to those games without this kind of media.
Yeah, it sort of gives that sense of community that it kind of forms around every single game. And back when the NES was out for certain games, or even the Sega Genesis for Sonic 2, there wasn't that sense of community until it was networked through our social media and through like seeing other people play it on YouTube. It was kind of like this enclosed space that we all took part in.
Yeah, the way you said like the kind of the creation of the community through parasocial play is a lot like how I would, talk with my friends in grade school about like the Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo, or we'd take turns playing like Sonic, or, play Street Fighter together or something like that. Street Fighter 2. I'm not old enough to have owned Street Fighter 1. Yeah, it seems to have taken that place where you're now watching someone else and like everybody's talking about the play and their experiences.
I was listening to another podcast, what's it called? Triple Click recently, where they were talking about, I don't know if it was actually a recent episode, I was going through a backlog, but they were talking about how, YouTube and the internet generally have sort of supplanted the instruction manual that used to come with video games. And part of that has been sort of tutorialized into the games themselves, but also like, and I remember this, like a lot of games used to come with guides towards getting through the first like, chapter or like level or whatever in the instruction manual, as, part of a way of just showing you how the game works. I remember Pokemon, like Pokemon Red and Blue, had this really beautiful little book, which had like a partial Pokedex in the back that you could check off, and like you could, some of it would ID some of the Pokemon for you, but some of them were just question marks, so that was really cool and mysterious. And it would also just tell you like how to get through the first chunk of that game, I think up until the first gym. And games don't come with instruction manuals anymore, like at all. And I think that's partially because we've just become really used to just, we all have that friend who can show us how to beat the game, because that friend is YouTube.
I think we can do friend with quotation marks there. It's not YouTube itself is more of like the streaming service that we have access to. It as like a foundation is kind of crap.
Yeah, that's for sure. And that actually reminds me of what I was going to say. I feel like the one thing that is cool about YouTube that I'm seeing lately is there was a while where, like before, when streaming was first, kicking off, like everybody sort of navigated to Twitch, which everybody still does navigate to Twitch, but YouTube then, like, it was first like you would go to YouTube for the Let's Plays or for the walkthroughs, and it would be like an after the fact type of idea. And then Twitch allowed it to all happen at the same time, but then YouTube expanded so that you could do like YouTube Live, and I feel like it hasn't quite taken over in streaming, like hasn't taken much away from Twitch, I don't think. Somebody correct me on that if I'm wrong. But you sort of see an even more of that, like a much larger community aspect than before, when it was just like posting the video and then in the comments or whatever, or talking about that one YouTube video you saw with your friends. Like that community was established, but now it's even more expansive because of YouTube live streams and things like that.
And that's pretty good for what's happening in terms of the community building. But what are some of the more concerning notes that we might have with the parasocial play that comes with this outlet?
I think for the first few things that I can sense is I don't want to say not having any regulations, because that's not the word I want. But essentially, it's sort of like a no man's land in terms of rule sets, and it's becoming a little bit more regulated now, but for different reasons and for dumb reasons. But like a 12-year-old could go watch any type of Let's Play or any type of thing on YouTube and walk away from it, and that content might not be the most appropriate, or it could community members won't necessarily have a way of regulating themselves or others in that community, so there's more chance of harm happening if somebody says or does something that's not really 100% ideal. But then at the same time, if you overregulate a platform like YouTube, then you run the risk of, like, you completely restrict creators' ability to actually create anything. And we're sort of seeing that weird backlash now with, like, YouTube trying to implement certain regulations more for their profit margins than anything else. And then it's really damaging to creators.
Yeah, the whole idea of like Twitch kind of being unregulated is scary when like you hear stories about like the US Army twitching and like using that as a cover for recruiting people, which is like, yeah, the kind of thing that like I wouldn't want my 12-year-old kid watching and being like, hey, joining the army is a good thing.
I think one of the other things that concerns me too is YouTube is, at the end of the day, still a private, like, corporate entity. It's become so much more than that. So it's kind of this weird space where, like, at the end of the day, we still have to be careful, because they're going to want to do anything that they can for corporate benefit and for capitalistic ends and all of that stuff. So when you have this platform that's as wide-reaching as YouTube and is as unfamiliar, because we're still trying to figure out how to navigate it, and is always changing, but then it's being backed by that big corporate giant, it's kind of concerning and scary, at least from both a viewer but also a creator standpoint.
So on that note, because I think that like my concerns with respect to it actually trend more towards these sort of questions of co-optation. So I wanted to share something I read while we were sort of like leading up to this. I finally got around to reading Gene Burgess and Joshua Green's book on YouTube, which is an interesting book, mostly because it was the bulk of the research was done in like 2006 to 2008 in the early stages of YouTube's existence, and they got like a pitch deck, like a YouTube pitch deck before it was funded, before it was like acquired by Google or any of that. So from 2005, basically it was sort of describing what the business model could be at a time when there was no sort of platform like this, and it's a sort of four fold model where the four prongs are advertising, act as a for-pay distribution channel for promotional videos, charge members for premium features, charge viewers for premium content. It is now 2021, and YouTube is doing all of those things. And the thing I want to sort of stress here is that YouTube is and has always been the business it is now. Like when we sort of look at the history of YouTube, we can talk about these sort of early periods when it was sort of, there was more of this Wild West thing. It was still figuring out its identity. And I think from a user perspective, that's very true. Like it's taken a long time, you know, there's been a lot of change and evolution in terms of what people make and upload to YouTube. But at the corporate level, it is the same thing it always was, and it has been, it has always been primarily a money-making machine, and they haven't really diverged from their original monetization models, like really at all. And I think that like one thing that I see now is a lot of things in its algorithm and the way that the website operates, I see it sort of building those things up. Like I think a lot of us can remember a time when YouTube wasn't cramming advertisements in our faces all the time. But also that happens on the level of content creation. There's a sort of tendency to promote more professionalized content and also YouTube kind of creates the terms for what professionalization on YouTube means. Like high profile content creators have some influence there, but it is increasingly the case that if you want to get any kind of traction there, you need to be able to compete with what the biggest names are doing, which is why, I mean, speaking of YouTubers, Video Game Donkey did this thing that was like really funny and kind of dark, I think for a few weeks in the new year, where he just was like, it started with a video called "I'm Done Making Good Videos." And he just sort of did this really sort of standard YouTube thing where he was like, I'm doing like Among Us Thursdays and Among Us Tuesdays. And it's parodic, but it's like watching those videos, it's astonishing how much there is now this sort of YouTube aesthetic, especially in the gaming space, like this YouTube gaming content aesthetic that has become highly formalized and highly professionalized. And that was a long rant, so I'm going to shut up now. But I do sort of worry about its future as a space where weird things can happen.
Yeah, I remember the donkey thing, and I thought it was really really wild to do. But yeah, kind of dark and biting. And you bring up such a good point about like you need to consider like on the surface people are like, well, it's YouTube, anybody can watch whatever, but like certain algorithms promote certain kinds of content, and definitely you're gonna get a lot of watches after like for playing some big game like I can't even think of
Among Us, Fall Guys.
Thank you. Instead of like some indie game on itch that that's come out this week. And I kind of lost my train of thought, but yeah, it's worth thinking like all the different influences that are pushing creators to create a certain way. But I'll watch videos and I'll almost feel like really concerned about the like work-life balance of a creator who is like, I stream 3 days a week, I create videos 2 days a week, you can find me on Sunday where I like release this compilation, and it's actually kind of terrifying how like they're very much like working themselves to death through streaming and creating.
On top of that, at the beginning, you were talking about how YouTube kind of governs with the algorithms, what people watch and what's popularized. One of the things that I wanted to know was that when this was just an initial starting point for the platform, the things that were most popular were things like PewDiePie, Games Grumps, and a lot of this content came from like white male gamers and the same kind of gamers that we've kind of just come to associate with gaming as a genre as a whole, pretty much. PewDiePie is still like the number one channel. I don't know if T-Series beat him. I didn't follow that, but the main thing to take away is that a lot of the stuff that came out when it was just starting off is that it was incredibly problematic in terms of how it later came to like define the gaming genre as a whole. So this kind of like the way that the gaming genre was algorithmed and pushed, it made it so that there was a lot of toxicity that came out of the communities, just because a lot of the creators that were doing stuff at the time were putting out ideas and ways of playing that kind of like reinforced toxic masculinity, toxic culture, toxic gaming culture altogether.
That's an interesting point, because that's also the point where it becomes, like, especially if we're looking at things like Gamergate, this is also the point where it becomes impossible just to talk about YouTube. You're not wrong. Like, you're 100% correct that like a lot of these sort of big names on YouTube, especially in gaming, are white heterosexual men. I remember actually around in 2015 when Gamergate was starting to, or 2014, 2015 when Gamergate was starting to bubble up. That was the first time I heard about tropes against women in gaming, and I started watching it one night before going to bed, and I fell asleep. And when I woke up, autoplay was still going some like 4 or 5 hours later. But I guess it had exhausted all the tropes against women in gaming things, and it was now giving me this like maximum red pill energy, like takedowns of Anita Sarkeesian, and it had queued up like dozens of them. And it took years for me to correct the algorithm after that, to convince it that no, I didn't want more of this crap, because it thought I had binge watched it. So speaking of algorithms, but also that's also where YouTube sort of became part of this bigger ecosystem of platforms, right? Like a lot of the organizing for Gamergate happened on Reddit and 4chan and Twitter. And those sort of fights spilled out into YouTube, but largely sort of, the battles were fought largely on other platforms.
I found mostly, and I did like years ago, did like a presentation on Gamergate for a class. And yeah, my algorithms were like, just horrible, toxic people, like, trying to pick apart, everything Anita Sarkeesian said, but just like, because they were mad because she didn't like Hitman or something like that. I'm belittling it because these people don't deserve attention. But maybe I'll follow up and say one thing I find positive that kind of works against sort of like the hegemony of play that we see so much through like what games are popular, and what kind of gameplays they promote, is the idea of like playing games wrong as entertainment. What comes to mind? The McElroy family, like from Adventure Zone and My Brother and Me, Griffin. They also like started Polygon, but one of the brothers, Griffin McElroy, did something called Peacecraft, where he played Warcraft, but was not violent. He just wanted to like run as far as he could. And him and his brother Justin also have one where they try and use a character creator to make the most like wacky looking person possible in a video game, and then just play the game as silly as possible. And it really it reminds me of Bo Ruberg's writing, mostly about like no fun, the like queer, like a way to queer playing of a game, which is then based on Jack Halberstam's the idea of like queer art of failure, but like the like kind of refusal to have fun with a game through what it considers to have fun, like the sort of like hegemonic way of playing a game. They kind of like turn it on its head and say, no, we're playing it this way, and finding new ways to play with the game. But then I catch myself again because I'm talking about like this kind of, as Bo Ruberg would say, like a queer way of playing a game, but then we're also it's being spearheaded by, again, white heterosexual people who own a large, not own, but are like the founders of a large video game entertainment website.
One funny thing with Peacecraft is it's sort of, we haven't really talked a lot about the parasocial aspects of this yet, but Peacecraft fell victim to that in a really interesting and dramatic way. in that like, so Peacecraft came around, I think like 2016-ish, at like a time 2016 2017, at a time when walking simulators were having a big moment, like in sort of games journalism and games scholarship. Basically, Griffin never says this, but basically what he's doing is he's playing WoW as a walking simulator. But what ended up happening is after 3 or 4 episodes, people figured out, or maybe it just showed up on the video, what server he was playing on, and he was just getting swarmed when he was recording by fans, like, who were just like running around, like giving him like rare mounts and stuff like that. Like he gets a motorcycle in like episode 4 or 5, and so it's this. Again, speaking of the parasociality of it, it's this moment where its original intention as this sort of peaceful, like meditative thing that's also kind of Chaotian and self-defeating, instead becomes this like ridiculous romp buoyed on its own like fandom. And I think that sort of, at least for me, dovetails into one of the other things, is that we have, you start to have these big personalities in gaming, which I think is a relatively novel thing. Like prior to this, you had like, a handful of esports champs, but I was not really, you didn't really hear about people who were good at video games before there was this way of sharing them, at least unless you happen to move in very particular circles. Whereas now, like people, develop these sort of attachments to these other individuals through video games and through this sort of like content around them playing it. I don't mean to. I also realize that I don't mean to sort of sidestep the other question which we were discussing, which was this question of the homogeneity of the content creators. Yeah, so I guess we should return to that topic because I just went off on a huge tangent.
No, but I think it follows well the idea of who are these big game players, these big streamers that people are following. I think it loops back in, and it's kind of the same sorts of people.
All right. Well, going off of that, how do you think marketing has sort of evolved to meet this new form of media? Because, like, we've seen it countless times in which the advertisements are crammed down our throat. But, like, what sort of evolution have we seen go throughout the entirety of YouTube existence?
Nintendo comes to mind. Nintendo as a company seems to be under the impression that if people watch Let's Plays, they won't want to buy the games, which is completely not the case. And I remember hearing a lot about like Nintendo kind of, like sending takedowns to videos that did Let's Plays of Nintendo games. And then sometime in the last year, they were, they, I guess, realized it's actually beneficial. But, and then on the other hand, like if you can't see a playthrough of a game before it's released, people get very suspicious, like like they did with Cyberpunk 2077, where CD Projekt Red didn't let creators or reviewers who like had the game or whatever like stream the game. I think it was especially they couldn't stream it on like PS4s or Xbox Ones. Being able to see a game being played, especially from like your favorite creator, becomes a big part of a game's marketing.
Yeah, I feel like it's replaced. I don't know if you would all remember, or if I'm aging myself. Remember having like the demo cases at like Best Buy or like at EB Games? Like I feel like Let's Plays or having like the like at E3 when they release like the gameplay footage. I feel like that has replaced those like demo boxes. I don't think they're actually called demo boxes, but like the little glass cases where like the console would be plugged into whatever TV and then they would let you play whatever game was about to come out or had just been released or whatever.
Yeah, and like magazines would have like discs, like you could get a PlayStation magazine or Xbox magazine and they'd have like demo discs. Or back in the day you could buy like shareware on floppy disks.
Well, and speaking of Nintendo, that's one place where they've been really sort of ahead of the game, is in terms of their use of these like of YouTube as a primary marketing platform. In that they were one of the first, I think maybe the first big game company to walk on E3. Like I think the last E3 that was, the last proper E3 that was held, they didn't. I think it was they didn't do a stage show, which is like that's usually the big event, right? Everyone does like this huge stage show. It's extensively produced. They, if there's a new console, they roll it out. There's like like an hour of new game, hype or whatever. And Nintendo just did a direct instead. their marketing is really strange and really different from the other major companies. But I think they sort of understood that sort of gamer spectacle, the big stage show, like the fancy hype thing, isn't really what their brand is, or what, who they're selling to. Like, more than other companies, they're marketing to children, they're marketing to families, they're marketing to people who don't really invest in like the aesthetics of a video game trade show. And so they've really leaned into the sort of direct, like the Nintendo Direct video dumps and the Nindies showcases and stuff like that, to the exclusion of most other forms of advertising.
I think with YouTube specifically for their kind of advertising, the video game industry has kind of gotten around the idea that people aren't that keen on watching a 15-second video, and they're more likely to skip it if they make it any longer than that. They've been targeting the YouTubers themselves to talk about the games. Like, I think about for the past 2 years now, I haven't been able to go a week without hearing about Raid Shadow Legends being talked about. So that's interesting how they're able to kind of subvert those, what's it called, algorithms that are just kind of like putting advertisements out there for you to latch on to, and that should be tailored to your interests.
I was gonna say, I think what's really interesting about that too is that you see, like, specifically with Raid Shadow Legends, I remember seeing that on a Binging with Babish video. So like, you see it sort of seep in, especially like mobile games. You see those advertisements seep into different categories that are not games related, and I always found that kind of strange, but a neat way of getting around the algorithm.
Well, so there's a lot of the academic research right now around influencers in gaming is actually looking at that sort of embedded advertising. So like things like getting YouTubers to make their own ads for things like Raid, but also, the practice of just sending code to influencers so that they can like cover your game before it comes out or just after it comes out. And for like a few years, the sort of wisdom in the industry at large has been that you need influencers, like you need streamers and you need YouTubers to cover your games. I remember, sorry, as a quick aside, when Crusader Kings 3 came out a few months ago, YouTube was on fire. And there were a bunch of YouTubers who were saying, like, yeah, like I got promo code for this game. And I'm going to show, like the bunch of YouTubers who did Crusader Kings content were all at the same time receiving code for the game and being like, please make a bunch of videos in like the week between your receiving this and this game releasing. So those models have become really prevalent. And there was some research done by, I'm going to get the full list of our authors and not just the ones I've spoken to at conferences. Phelan Parker and some other people, and I will get the full list in just a moment, have done some really interesting research about how that translates to the indie space. So, like, is it true in the indie space that like more exposure, like more YouTube coverage for your game equals like better sales? Matthew Perks is the other author he's working with. And what their study found is that, at least at the independent level, at the AAA level, it seems pretty clear that kind of exposure makes a difference. At the indie level, it remains deeply unclear. And what they heard from a lot of developers is that they actually didn't get like any significant sales bump from YouTube coverage. It seemed like they both need it just to be discoverable at all, but also that a lot of people who watch at least sort of indie content, sort of smaller auteurish games, who watch them streamed, then feel that they don't need to buy it themselves. And this actually comes back to what Sabrina was saying, the AAA companies were afraid of. And what it looks like is at the AAA level, no, more visible. Like when you're looking at that level of exposure and that high a profile, you really do want those extra views because people will buy it. But when you're talking about these more modest games, and that may be smaller, maybe shorter, people seem more likely to feel that having watched someone else play it is enough, and that their curiosity about that game is satisfied through watching other players. This is sort of a general phenomenon across the games industry, just that there's this huge divide between AAA developers and indie developers, and that what works for one often doesn't work for the other. And that seems to also be the case when it comes to like video coverage.
like there's so many places where you can find out about the new releases and see games being played of like, AAA and kind of the more commercial indies. But where's that happening? Or is it even happening with like kind of the lower, not lower tier indies, but the less commercial indies and the more DIY stuff? Like it's there seems to be a lot less, I guess, mass social media coverage and more like community based stuff, like at like zine type fairs or community gatherings.
I think that's also where you start to get like where like specialized influencers become a thing. Like Patrick, on the last podcast, we were talking about PS1 aesthetics, and in the intervening month, I found a YouTuber who basically just covers like early to mid 90s. Like he has like a whole series on the Thief game.
Well, I guess following off, yeah, I find kind of what Alex was talking about. There are people devoted to like retro games and like a certain like aesthetic of retro games, like whether it be 8-bit, 16-bit, and a lot of Let's Plays, like they're not happening anymore, but what was it, the James and Mike Mondays, which was like the angry video game nerd, and like his producing partner. Would just kind of hang out and play retro games. And there's a lot of like Let's Plays of retro games, but not so much like the kind of indie games that might look like those retro games.
Yeah, so I mean that was exactly what I was getting at, is that there are these sort of more like like niche influencers, right? And like sort of it's not just there's not just a community of YouTubers or like a community of gaming YouTubers, but you have people who just do like this sort of low poly stuff, right? And that's their whole thing. Like I found out recently that Liz Ryerson has an entire series of like 30 to 50 odd videos just playing through different new like Doom maps, like custom Doom maps. Like you've got all these people who do this really, really sort of narrow stuff and appeal to these narrower communities. And I think those are sort of the channels by which some of these more niche things aim to reach audiences.
So to sum up, YouTube interesting, but also maybe bad.
Yeah. There's another part I want to hit on here, which is like I touched on this before, but the idea of sort of entertaining these relationships with people. I'm gonna go into this through an anecdote and see where I come out. But so my most intense engagement with gaming content on YouTube was during a really sort of rough mental health patch a few years ago when I basically did nothing but lie in bed and watch Game Grumps. And the reason for that is because I was in another country, super duper lonely, and Game Grumps was the only thing that made me feel like sane on a day-to-day basis, because there was like this sort of comfort to it. Like it was like, okay, it's two people who are friends with each other playing video games and telling jokes, which is a thing, which is a thing I can relate to and feel at home in. And so like I'm not going to say Game Grumps like healed me or like, but it got me through it. Which is something I'm still really grateful. And it's something that's funny to me now because I don't actually particularly like their videos and I don't actually particularly like their sense of humor. Like a lot of the times I'm like, this is really gross. This is really like sort of juvenile and I don't know, it just doesn't work for me. But at that point, like that sort of like easy laughs and just like two people liking playing video games together was doing so much for me. Like I have a lot of affection for their playthrough of Super Mario 3D World, which just got ported to Switch, and I've been playing the hell out of it. And I was really excited about it, partially because I'd watched them play it and never played it myself before. But I think that so where I'm trying to get at that is, and what I touched on before, is that I do think that the involvement of these personalities, right, sort of changes what it means to relate to these video games. Like it's not like I mean, it's not always the case, but it can be the case now that, for instance, when we're playing a horror game, it's not just about getting, whatever the sort of untouched, like the pure experience of that game or whatever that means, but it's also a way of sort of in like relating to these personalities that we're attached to. So like when you're playing a horror game, it's a way of sort of relating, or it can be a way of relating to like PewDiePie or Markiplier, or it's a way of reenacting the sort of those activities that may have been sort of special to you or enjoyable for you to witness. And I guess I don't know where I go from there, except that I think that it does sort of introduce a new piece into the equation of what it means to sort of be in a relationship with a video game.
Now, we've all talked about like some of the more popular YouTubers, gaming YouTubers out there, but I just like to go through all of us really quick to just kind of give our take on one that is kind of overlooked or one that might be our favorite that just hasn't that isn't like one of the top 5 that is on YouTube trending.
There's a particular YouTuber that I really like. Her name is actually Fake Gamer Girl. Totally not like most other gaming channels that I follow. What she's most, I guess, famous for, although she's big enough, but not quite like super big yet. What she's most famous for is her like Sims 4 builds and her videos of like where she sort of like creates little episodic adventures with various characters in either The Sims 4 or The Sims 3, and I absolutely adore it because it's hilarious.
My main involvement with YouTubers is like learning about games that I probably wouldn't get around to playing otherwise. So I've got 2. Okay, so the first is Cannot Be Tamed. She does these sort of deep dive reviews into like really obscure retro games. She has like a really impressive collection of like old consoles and games, and she just kind of like walks you through them, talks about what works, what doesn't. And they're just like a lot of them are these really fascinating deep cuts. Like she just did one on a game called Conquest of the Crystal Palace, which is an NES game that I have never, ever, ever heard of. And a lot of the times I'm like, these look neat, but I would never take the time to play this through. So it's kind of fun. Like I just like that she has and that she can then sort of tell me about it. Another one is Pelvic Gaming, exclusively sort of long-ish reviews of like 20-minute-ish reviews of like JRPGs, and they're really fun. And I just really like JRPGs, but don't have the time to play nearly as many as I would like to. So I learn about all the ones I won't have time to play from her, and every so often I actually play one. And then the last one is, I think he's a little more well known, but Noah Caldwell Gervais, who does these like it's almost I don't know, it almost feels like outsider art to me. He does these like 2 to 3 hour long video essays on like various like games and gaming franchises of note. He just did a really interesting one on Half-Life, which is a game I've never played but now really want to. And it is rare to get to, to get to go so deep into the weeds on someone's thinking about a single game or a small set of games as he goes in all of his videos. I don't always agree with him. Like he did one on The Last of Us Part 2 that I just thought, I don't know. There were just some points where I'm like, no, that's not landing with me. But I still really enjoy just sort of being able to get into the nitty gritty of how he's thinking about these games and how he's putting together his ideas about them.
My pick for YouTuber would be Sonic Fox. A lot of my friends are crazy about them. They do a lot of fighting game stuff. They do stuff with Mortal Kombat, Guilty Gear Strive, Dragon Ball, and from what my friend tells me, they are the greatest esports player alive.
Didn't they win some kind of like big award not that long ago? Maybe a year ago now?
Yes, it's slipping my mind. But yeah, I thought that I would give them a shout out because they only have about 199,000 subscribers, but they deserve more considering the accomplishments that they've made with their life.
It was the Game Awards for Best Esports Athlete. So there you go.
Most of the like YouTubers that are little known that I really like are like retro game people. So I'm thinking of, there's this one guy called the LJN Defender, who's just this really earnest, nerdy guy who like takes games that are like really kind of like popularly like crapped on, like retro games, and like kind of looks at the good in them. And he's just very earnest and excited about what he's talking about. There's also one called Classic Games Room, which is just some guy who must have like a nice, comfortable job and can just buy a bunch of retro games and talk about them. But I would actually like to know if anyone listening to this know of good YouTubers or good streamers that talk about kind of like indie or DIY games. I know I'm trying to be one, but I want to know more stuff about like where to find out about these games.
I've got one for you there if you're interested.
Please.
Aaron
my
Signal.
YouTube open. Sorry?
I don't know if Aaron Signal, I don't know if he's been super active lately, but he does a lot of indie game reviews. Doesn't look like he's been uploading much. Oh no, he's around.
Aaron Signal?
Errant.
Errant.
Errant Signal.
All right. Then with that, I think that we should introduce ourselves one more time, including social media, and then I can do the outro.
Sure. So I am Sabrina. I am your editor-in-chief and also your book review section head. And you can find me on Twitter at Sabrina Alicia SG. Alicia spelled ALICIA. And also on Twitch, www.twitch.tv/BrainiacBree.
I'm Patrick. I am the managing editor and head of essays. I also stream on Twitch at Dr. Sandmonster and through FPS First Person Scholar, where I like what I want to watch. It's mostly pixel games and indie polygonal games. But if you know, again, of any people who stream those kind of games or talk about those kind of games, at me on Twitter at @rdolan.
I'm Alex Chalk. I am the head of commentaries at FPS, and you can find me on Twitter at Alex_I_Chalk. That's CHALK, like the stuff you write with.
And my name's Giuseppe Femia. I am the First Person Podcast producer, and you can find me at _Foolsbait on Twitter. And probably nowhere else because I'm not public anywhere else. So thank you for listening to the First Person Podcast. And what is your favorite gaming channel? Let us know on Twitter at FPS Weekly or start a conversation using the hashtag First Person Podcast on Twitter. First Person Podcast is produced by Giuseppe Femia with support from the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo.